Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Okay, perfect.
Hello,
so
welcome to the latest Pep Talk. This week we have Priyanca D'Souza, and over to you, Priyanka.
Cool. So today I'm going to be talking about intersectionality and considering the impact of compounding barriers when we consider accessibility. I'm going to be starting off with a case study. It's quite short. It's not all about death, but there are brief references to suicide, which are over very quickly, but just like a warning. To maybe zone out for the next 2 minutes if you don't want to listen to that. So yeah, I'll start with a case study to bring to life the things I want you to remember and think about. I'd like to clarify this is not a talk about biohacking. I want you to reflect on this question and think of characteristics or reasons why people may die prematurely. I've included 3 figures on the slide, 2 in 10, 2 in 10, and 9. What do you think the numbers refer to? It's not a trick question. It's here to get you thinking. Maybe put what you think the numbers refer to in the chat, like, what you think they might be. I'm just interested what people are saying. Hopefully. Anyone have any thoughts? What you think those numbers might refer to? So, I'm going to talk about some statistics relating to autism and anorexia. So anorexia has the worst outcomes of any mental health condition, with 2 in 10 people dying early. More than 2 in 10 women with autism have anorexia. 9 people with autism with no additional learning disability are 9 times more likely to commit suicide. And the Maudsley Eating Disorder Service says that almost 35% of their patients have autism. However, the NICE guidelines on eating disorders don't mention autism. So restrictive eating for autistic people can often be due to sensory processing and difficulty coping with distress caused by unaccommodating environments and people. It can be a way to try and get some order in a world that is chaotic and messy. 80% of women who have autism remain undiagnosed at 18 and are much less likely than men to be recognised as having autism in the first place. It's also thought that high levels of stress and anxiety caused by the condition going undiagnosed can contribute to people experiencing severe mental health issues. So by the time someone becomes an adult, they will already have had many, many difficult life experiences. There's also that kind of added layer that neurodivergent women are often not diagnosed, if at all, until later in life. So current treatments fail to meet people's needs, not taking into account the coexistence of these conditions. And this can be really fatal. Anorexia has the worst mortality outcomes of any mental health condition. And this is not something I feel is given that much attention. It's not something you hear about very much. If you focus only on eating without addressing underlying psychological reasons, you're not actually like solving a whole problem for users. For example, dramatically changing someone's eating routine within a short period of time sounds like a special kind of hell for someone that needs to have control and for things to be predictable and consistent. A clinician commented that they had this subset of patients who didn't do very well in group therapy, and their response was, let's put them in more groups, and it just alienated people even more. So this is why I'm speaking to you. I feel like service design and user-centered design needs to be proactive in addressing compounding barriers to avoid further amplifying existing inequalities. If we zoom in too much on solving a problem for one group of people, or just focus on a single characteristic, we can actually involuntarily make experiences less inclusive. And the assumption that these people don't exist, who have multiple compounding barriers, is wrong. I'm one of them. We often don't consider how these barriers could intersect with each other and overlap and interact with context. We might consider how accessibility will interact with a touch point in a really controlled environment, but not considering how like lived experience can interact with an experience like over time. I hope you come away from the talk recognizing and reflecting on the value of centering and respecting lived experience. Cool. So let's descope this. So I wonder if this is a phrase that feels familiar to you. So I work on services in government as a user researcher, and these are often, some of them are used by millions of citizens. And I often hear the term that something has been descoped or it's in the backlog. I've heard the assumption that our users are professional people, skilled people, specialists or scientists. And it's often the assumption that these people then won't have access needs, which is untrue. Anyone can have access needs. I've encountered lots of users who lack the digital confidence or the literacy to effectively get through and understand public services. I remember doing some user research and troubleshooting, and part of the journey involved QR code. And there might be users who have no idea what a QR code is, let alone how to use one to help them. So even if we descope accessibility or user-centered design, real people can't descope parts of their lived experiences. Our users are not one-dimensional people who experience one characteristic at a time. They can't just descope barriers which are not convenient to them. Also, different access needs and barriers can coexist in the same person. The complexity and the barriers of people's real lived experiences will still exist, even if we don't research or design for it. We just won't be prepared. When a situation presents itself which is incompatible with my access needs, I can't decide to descope my access needs. This could be anything from when a lift is out of order, or if the gap between the platform for a train and the train itself is much wider than expected. All of these kind of small things can have an impact on people with access needs or barriers, and it's not something I can just decide to descope. Disabled people are often already shrinking to be the least inconvenient versions of themselves. If they end up vocalizing that they need help, it's probably because it's currently not possible to do something independently with their existing conditions. I would rather have my autonomy and independence, but sometimes that's not possible. I don't know if anyone has ever used special assistance at an airport, but that can be a very interesting experience where you are pretty much giving up your autonomy and putting it into the hands of strangers. And you can sometimes just be treated like a baggage, or it can be quite, it's interesting how people would treat disabled people differently. I remember once being told by a person that they would go as slowly as possible. I was like, I don't need you to go as slowly as possible. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about ambassador fatigue. It takes energy to be visible and vocal and to complain about stuff if you've not had a good experience. If you work on a team which says no disabled people have complained, how easy is it to flag issues in the first place? How easy is it to get in touch with your team? How accessible is the complaints procedure? If an inaccessible service has taken longer than expected to use, or has really kind of got you down, then that person then has even less time and energy to feed back on the experience. It's kind of time that they don't have. I have multiple access needs, but when I interact with services or fill out forms, the choices are often presented as radio buttons and not checkboxes. And I feel like by only picking one option, the information being submitted about me is not actually accurate and doesn't actually represent me. This can be anything from signing up to an event and trying to kind of fill out demographic information to like medical information, where I feel like actually multiple categories apply, but I don't have the option to select multiple options. When I was at university, I had to go to separate people and different buildings, one to talk about my neurodevelopmental condition, and another building and another person to talk about my long-term health condition, even though, you know, I'm one person. And if you think of like the extra load and the extra admin that these things have, is often magnified because people often don't just have health conditions, they have lots of other barriers and life conditions that they're also going through. And it only gets kind of more complicated. If you don't see any options which really reflect you, you might feel misunderstood, invisible, or like there is a lack of understanding of people like yourself, like they haven't actually considered that people like you are going to be interacting with the service or product or guidance. Even filling out lots of forms, and it's like, oh, if A go this way, if B go this way, what if both? Has anyone experienced a situation where you have tried to access help or support, but you've been told you're not eligible to use a service because you're too complex, or you don't meet their expectations of a service user, or that you're too high functioning? This is what I would describe as when your problems are not vanilla enough. I feel like just because a person isn't diagnosed with something doesn't mean that they don't experience all the barriers and issues associated and attached to a particular condition or accessibility need. And just because they're not diagnosed with something doesn't mean they don't exist. You might not have users who are diagnosed with these barriers, but actually, if you're not diagnosed with something, you might be more likely to experience difficulties because you don't have the awareness of why things are difficult, or be aware of ways to overcome those hurdles in ways that don't make other aspects of your life worse, or access to people who have shared lived experience, knowledge of the kind of support you could have and have access to. I feel like we can't just ignore information about people because it's inconvenient or it makes them too messy or complex. People are complex. One of the inspirations for me talking about intersectionality were these brilliant posters from the Home Office about designing for different access needs. And I think it's really interesting, and it's great that we have guidance for designing for screen reader users and designing for autism and designing for hearing. But like, it's completely possible for someone to have multiple barriers at the same time. And assistive technology is brilliant. It's really helpful, but then it puts more pressure onto the modalities that you do have. If you have visual access needs, but you also simultaneously have auditory access needs and also dyslexia, then a slightly different approach might be required because you can't rely alone on audio. And situationally, you might not be able to access that auditory modality that they're assuming is going to kind of substitute your vision. I've found this wheel is quite interesting. It's called the Wheel of Power Privilege. And it just lists a load of different barriers or constraints that people can experience. And I think it's useful to think wider than disability and think of things like language, housing, sexuality, education, skin color, citizenship, wealth, gender, because all of these things can impact your ability to have access to services and support with interacting with services. Because you could have multiple people who have the same disability, but their ability to kind of access something or get through a service or be able to do something can really vary based on other factors beyond the disability. So I'm going to talk about Dragon. I am one of those mythical assistive technology users that teams often say don't exist. Yeah, I've been using Dragon for around 13 years. When I was at university, I had to spend a lot of time using science journals, often finding that experience quite inaccessible. I often felt like I was being trolled by the software because I would give the correct instructions to Dragon. And for example, you can you can give instructions for it to select areas of the page and it to download a particular document. And it was sometimes I give the instruction 1 and it would download the PDF that was on the third link. It was basically like those links hadn't been tagged up in a way that was compatible with Dragon. It did often make me feel like when I was interacting with those services that they weren't expecting someone who used assistive technology to be interacting with them. And I had to use them every day. I was also recommended programs that were incompatible with each other. So I'm having to use different assistive technology tools, which are primarily maybe designed for different access needs. But like those access needs coexist in me. I'm one person. So I was given this diagramming software, which you couldn't actually operate using keyboard controls, wasn't compatible with Dragon, made it very difficult to use, basically. And yeah, that's interesting because people who have access needs likely to have multiple barriers and not just one. So at this point, I have written some questions which I'd like people to kind of reflect on. This is the chance for you to talk if you feel comfortable to, or raise your hand. And yeah, it'll be interesting to hear from people who are here and who are listening to see if any of these things resonate with you. So yeah, the first kind of discussion area is to think of circumstances where you have felt left out or like you couldn't fully take part in something and what it felt like to be excluded. I'm just going to switch to looking at the main view to see if anyone has said anything or if anyone wants to talk about this. Diminished. Yeah. Alien. Were there particular circumstances that made you feel like this, if you're comfortable sharing? If you don't, there's no pressure. I know it's a quiet group. Yeah, definitely. I'm going to talk through the other questions, but then at the end, there'll be kind of opportunities for people to discuss anything that particularly resonates with them. I'll just make sure I'm in the right window. Okay. Yeah, the next area that I thought would be interesting for people to think about is how you define yourself and what are the defining parts of your own identity. Are there areas where you feel uncertainty about how you define yourself? For example, the gender identity that you are is not available on the form. I remember speaking to someone at Welsh GovCamp who was Black and Welsh and Muslim, but they felt that it was very difficult for them to identify as those things officially, because that kind of combination of identities wasn't often available on forms. Can you think of people whose voices and perspectives are often overlooked or erased, people who are rendered invisible? And can you think of some examples why that might be, why their perspectives are often erased, why their needs continue to go unmet? Yeah, this is just sort of a reminder that I feel like accessibility is not something that can just be automated or something we can delay until kind of later on in development phases. It's much more than computers. I think we forget that people have these kind of whole challenging lives beyond their online interactions with a service. But if we're making those interactions, the touch points where they do interact with us more accessible, that is going to make their time and their experience better. You know, I can have an inaccessible web experience, but I also have inaccessible experiences like in the outside, in the world beyond that. I wanted to kind of wrap up on a positive note and talk about, I'll go in the right way, about this case study called Astro Access, which considered disabled people in space and whether they might be better adapted in some situation. So, for example, if you imagine a power cut happens maybe in winter, because at the moment we have longer daylight hours. People who rely on using their vision to navigate the world will be flailing around in the dark, but people who are used to navigating without their sight and draw from an alternative data source will be less affected by the darkness. And I also feel a bit like this as an assistive technology user, not having access to certain like modalities. I've had to adapt how I interact with things, and I found a lot of really useful alternative ways that you can still do things. So some people who are deaf have inner ear cochlear damage, which makes them immune to motion sickness, and therefore ideal candidates for studying motion sickness in space. Here's a picture of some disabled people in space. I really liked this quote from one of the people on that flight. So on that 0G flight, the person said, "I had my condition, the condition stayed, but the barrier went." And he said to live and work in space, all he needed were a couple of carabiners and some hooks. He described himself as being compact because he was an amputee and having upgradable parts. So in some situations, like having adapted to be with an access need can mean that you might actually cope better or have kind of found ways of doing things that maybe others might not have. And yeah, thank you for listening to me today. I will find a way to stop sharing, and yeah, it would be nice to hear what you think and your own thoughts. Thanks.
Nia, is that your hand up? Or were you just waving?
Oh, I was meant to be clapping. Sorry, was I putting my hand up? That was brilliant. Thank you, Priyanca.
Thank you.
Does anyone have any questions, any comments? Nazneen.
Hi, Priyanka. I was wondering if you have any suggestions for resources that we can tap into to inform our teams about all of these things that you talked about today?
Yeah, that's a good question. I remember seeing there's quite a few things that I have in mind. You might have heard of the Universal Barriers Framework, which I think is a really interesting way of thinking about the different barriers with the name that people might face interacting with a service, and it goes beyond disability. Yeah, I can maybe collate some links that can be sent out to you. I remember also finding this generator of like it's different where there's two different wheels and they both kind of randomly generate an access need. You have to consider how you would design for like a combination of those. And I think that's quite a good exercise because I think it's often the assumption, oh, person doesn't have this modality, they'll be able to do this instead. But that instead might not actually be possible because they might have another barrier. And I think that's like really useful to consider. I know for disabled people, often the route that they are put down as a paper route or an in-person route. I remember I was working on a service related to identity and proving your identity. And it was thought that people with visual access needs wouldn't be able to use the app, which would scan their face and hold their ID. And there'd be a bunch of different accessibility challenges. So the route they were sort of assumed to kind of be matched with was in person. But there are loads of accessibility challenges with getting to a post office and doing it in a post office and getting to that building itself. And I think we can sometimes zoom in too much on just the web experience, not consider people are actually going to have, if we're not making the web experience accessible, we're just pushing that problem into like other areas of the service. But yeah, I'm happy to like have a look into that. It's a great question.
Awesome. Thanks so much.
Any other questions?
I might jump in with a quick question. Priyanka, I was just wondering about, it sounds like you've done a load of research with loads of different people. I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about like how you got into user research and your sort of career path.
Okay, gosh, that's quite
Briefly.
there's a lot of things to address there. But so I probably had access needs and have lived with access needs before I was even aware of what user research was. I ended up studying cognitive neuroscience and psychology, which meant that I was learning a lot about how different people would experience the world. Like there's so many different things that can happen to, say, like your brain or your body that would really have a big impact on how you experience everything, which I found really fascinating. And I wanted to find a practical way of kind of using that empathy and that understanding and like research skills to try and like make things more accessible, more usable. And then I did some work through the government, through the civil service when I was a student. And that's when I first kind of came across user research. And then like ever since then, I wanted to like work in user research. And then I have the last few years been a user researcher in government. I've worked on lots of interesting services, including things like digital identity and like responding to the pandemic. And also worked on, there are like the services actually which are for like millions of people and like the vast services. Even though like there could be a lot of complexity and a lot of things to consider, in some ways working on internal specialist services, there can be more challenges advocating for accessibility, because I think people often assume that government, and Neera and I were talking about this earlier, we've had the service standard for a long time. A lot of the information about user-centered design is public. It's all published on the internet. Anyone can read it. But there are still like real gaps of understanding of accessibility, and the fact that internal service users will still have access needs, I think is still a bridge that needs to be crossed. And is still like, and I think as Lani mentioned in the chat, data poverty and digital inclusion, like digital still has a cost, both to us, the people creating the service, but also to the users taking part in it. And it may be a choice that you make. Yeah, and someone's found Cards for Humanity. Thanks for posting that.
Thank you.
I also think it's really cool that all of us working in like user-centered design, we actually have an opportunity to make things better and to have an impact and to make services more accessible. And I think that's really amazing that we can sort of channel all the kind of the experiences that we've had in our own lives where we felt like our needs have not been met, or we felt really dehumanized, or we felt othered. And we can actually try and make experiences better for people. Yeah.
Any other questions or comments? Maybe I could ask one more, Priyanka. Sorry, I've got loads. I could keep going all night. I was wondering, what's the one thing that you would just love to solve? Like one sort of thing that you notice all the time. You just think, oh, I just wish we could just stop doing this thing or just sort this thing out.
Oh gosh, okay. I've not prepared an answer to this, by the way.
Sorry.
I think there's a lot of different aspects to this. I feel like people using assistive technology is still kind of treated as a sort of fringe issue. But if you use assistive technology every day, for you, it's like fundamental to how you interact with things, and it isn't like an unusual thing. I remember even going to a visit, and maybe I'll get into trouble for saying this, but it was a Google Accessibility Center. They were like, sometimes assistive tech can almost be treated like a sort of special or other thing, but like, you know, I use this stuff like every day, and it's just like how I interact with a computer. It's like completely normal for me, but that's how I'd interact with things. I also think there's still like I mentioned this earlier, I think there's a kind of gap in like how we do user research on services that are for like designed for internal staff, internal users. I think the impact of having to use something inaccessible every day is huge for staff. And I think even in government, I think those services are often neglected. They are often not kind of assessed or like scrutinized under the same standards. But like the frequency, if you don't renew your passport every day, but if you're processing passport applications, you're going to be doing that over and over again. So I think like I think internal services and how we find participants for internal services who have access needs, but also have the level of subject matter understanding and the level of kind of technical skill is a kind of still like a gap that needs to be addressed, and is still like something that is really challenging and difficult. I think someone on the chat mentioned hearing access needs, and yeah, I think like not being able to hear can really impact your literacy levels, and just because there's a written version available doesn't actually mean that that version is accessible. I read Haben Girma's book. Do I have it in this one? I think it's interesting. It's a really good book. I'd recommend it. She is deaf and blind, and sometimes all that she wanted was for people to send her lunch menus digitally, so she could like listen to them using her own assistive technology. And then I think they were like, oh, someone can just like say it to you in the cafeteria. This is American. But it's a very loud, noisy environment. And she also is deaf blind. So that sometimes like, sometimes solutions can actually be quite simple and they're quite small. But I think like trying to preserve people's autonomy where possible is important, because you can be disabled, you can have access needs, but you're still an adult and you still want to preserve as much autonomy and dignity and independence as you can, despite like the barriers that you're facing.
There's another question here from Lanny. Lanny asks, do you have any particular area you're chipping away at right now?
So I'm currently working on an internal service for very technical users, and yeah, I think that's partly what's inspired my I've also previously worked on like admin interfaces and another government department, and I found that there was often like the presumption that because it was internal users, because it was specialist users, they wouldn't have access needs. I previously worked on digital identity, which was, on really large scale services, and it's almost easier to do research with external users with a variety of access needs and digital inclusion challenges. But I think for internal services, you might not, you don't actually, unless people tell you or reveal if they have access needs, it's actually hard to know what access needs or barriers people are facing. And I think like there is an assumption that it's level, but it really isn't. Like people have a huge range of differences in characteristics. I also feel like sensory aspects of sensory accessibility. That aspect of neurodivergence is often under considered in design. So for example, I often turn off the color on my phone, the color on my computer. I did turn it on right before this presentation. But I think like relying on color to indicate meaning, even though it can be useful in some situations, I think like trying to use something with the color turned off completely is quite good practice. It's a good idea. If I have to like basically change the way that I'm doing something, because I've like realized something is not, something is the only way to find out the meaning is through color, then that's maybe an indication that accessibility has maybe not been considered that thoroughly. If there are no other questions, I'm really happy to wrap up. I know it's a lovely evening.
I think this has been great, and all that's going through my head is it's something that's very present because I've just been in a couple of meetings, is around the paternalism of organizations thinking that they know best is a big problem. And all your stuff you're saying is amazing, it's blown my mind. And we need to start getting over I know best all the time when it comes from an organizational point of view, and actually start listening to the people that we're trying to help.
Yeah, I find it like, I think having that lived experience of being an assistive technology user and simultaneously hearing like so many people being like, oh, our users don't use assistive tech. And it's like, how do you know?
Cool.
Or like if they haven't received any complaints, and it's like it takes a lot of energy to complain, like let alone even like people, we work in these kind of spaces, and like if even reaching the right person in the right department, like as an external user, and other organizations seem very opaque and almost impenetrable. You're just kind of looking at this kind of, building, and you're like, I have no idea like how to contact the right person.
Lots of resource
Really
management goes on. It's always website first, content first, and all that type of stuff, where you sort of go, hold on a second, is there a way that somebody can actually contact us properly? I've had
that's true. And I think that's become harder actually, as we push more things like just we only have web channels, and there's like no longer a phone number. And especially if you are a case that is considered that doesn't fall into any of the like FAQs, or doesn't fall into the, oh, these are the commonly like issues. The reason that you want to actually talk to a human is because none of those things are addressing your needs directly, and you just want a chance to explain it, and you feel like you don't fit into any of those buckets because they've optimized away like that kind of nuance and that kind of consideration of like, it's a bit like fires don't often happen in this building. We're going to get rid of all the fire safety equipment because we don't use it often. But then like, it doesn't mean a fire is never going to happen.
This has been great. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for joining me. And I hope people who are here found it interesting. And I hope you enjoyed it.
Great. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks. Bye.